In the previous two episodes, I mentioned that a lot of green propaganda, climate change, panic porn, and all of that has its origins in China. Well, that can sometimes be framed as a controversial statement, but in this episode, I have some evidence as well for it. You will notice that a lot of the latest ideas that various green parties or green factions in Europe and sometimes North America as well actually do come from Chinese think tanks. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome once again to the Propaganda Basement. This time around we'll be reading China Daily, the edition from November the 10th to 16th, 2023. Hopefully we'll have enough time to read two newspapers today. So once again, Maoist style front page, setting the agenda. Successful outcome of a likely meeting between Xi and Biden would set a positive tone for China-US relations. Experts say, once again this thing with the experts, observers interviewed by China Daily are expressing hopes for a meeting on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Meeting. Kenneth Quinn, President Emeritus of World Food Price Foundation and a former U.S. Foreign Service officer, said whatever. Quinn said a bilateral meeting of heads of state could enhance and stabilize the relationship, which only recently had shown signs of emerging from its lowest level in decades. Once the US presidential election cycle, which usually features rhetoric attacking China, starts in January, there will likely be no further opportunities for any significant or even small steps by Washington, Quinn added. Now, to be fair, although it is a quasi-anonymous expert, he's not wrong about that. History proved him right. But then again, it also shows just how much of a preoccupation there is at the highest levels of Chinese propaganda about the electoral season. China and the US must relearn the habits of dialogue. Now again, the global outlet, the posh and polished version of the Globalist Times, would not be so keen about talking about dialogue if indeed China would be approaching this from a position of strength. But the thing is that in the subtext of all of this, China was approaching this from a position of weakness. Cooperation. Despite frayed ties, China and the US can still tackle climate change. There we go. Chinese foreign ministers, which many of the US viewed as one of the last chances to lay the groundwork for a meeting. Both sides agreed to work together to arrange a meeting between the two presidents. A White House official said, "We're planning for a constructive meeting between the leaders, but are still working together to put those plans in place." Once again, notice this. I mean, it's a very long article and it just doesn't say anything. Quite frankly, while preparing for this series, I read the entirety of all of these newspapers, the whole pile from here. Routinely, I had the opportunity... not just the opportunity, but I just had this impression that I'm just reading the same article multiple times, and also that I'm back in the 80s. I mean, this is the way the Romanian Communist Party would write its own propaganda. There you go. China and the US should join hands over climate change. Sanctions threat on Hong Kong officials, judges decried. Student youth games integration kicks off. Very, very important news. Not really. Top leader calls for stronger green efforts. And who is that top leader? Well, of course, it's President Xi Jinping, called on November the 7th for greater efforts to combat pollution and accelerate the green transformation of the development mode to achieve the goal of building a beautiful China by 2035 with fundamental improvement in the ecological environment. Once again, notice that The term has just been quietly pushed to 2035. It used to be 2030 until 5 minutes ago, civilizationally speaking, which again is a further indication that all of this is just mostly a grift. But then again, it's not just a grift, it's also a geopolitical play at the end of the day, and that as always has been. This particular edition dedicates a lot more space to the European Union in a way that previous ones wasn't. Xi tells German leader that it is important to uphold fair market competition and free trade. Yeah, of course. It's quite funny. Mr. Scholz got some promises from Xi Jinping, and just when he got home, his party and his coalition government collapsed. That's probably one of the many reasons why China is so frustrated with the democratic world, because, well, they can't bet on who's going to be with them for long enough. Then, of course, the traditional Sino-Greek ties. This one is a little bit more complicated. Let's see what the propaganda says. Countries urged to promote mutual learning, deepen cooperation on transport and shipping, of course. President Xi called on China and Greece to better align their development strategies, deepen cooperation in areas such as transportation, and promote mutual learning between the two civilizations during a meeting with Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis. Xi also expressed China's willingness to explore opportunities with Greece in the green economy. Yeah, the subtext here, so of course it doesn't say anything. The subtext here is that the Piraeus port in Greece has been owned by China for quite some time now. And this, for many years, this wasn't a problem, but now it suddenly is during the in the context of not just the Russo-Ukrainian war, but also the context of the shit show, for lack of a better term occurring in Syria, and of course with the fact that Turkey is not willing to play ball the way both China and Russia expected, even though on the sofa we said that the Sultan will not function like that. But anyway, so there you go, more EU. The EU and China can ensure that the rivalry is constructive. Now please note this very Asian way of writing in English. This is actually not necessarily a mistake. Maybe in the next season I'll show you. There is an article in Vientiane Times that says that this is evidence of a separate identity. It's actually quite funny, but that's a more autistic and nerdy type of point. Anyway, von der Leyen says strategic stability, high-level diplomacy, key to relations. European Commission President said there is a strong need for strategic stability in relations between the Европейский Союз and China, and that the rivalry element of the relationship can be constructive. She made the remark while addressing the EU Ambassadors' Conference in Brussels on November the 6th. Our relationship with China is one of the most intricate and important anywhere in the world, and how we manage it will be a determining factor for our future economic prosperity and national security, she said. In these turbulent times, there is a strong need for strategic stability in how we deal with China. We must get China right, von der Leyen said. There is an explicit element of rivalry in our relationship, she said, adding that China's goal is a systemic change of the international order with China at its center. We have seen it with China's positions in multilateral bodies, which show its determination to promote an alternative vision of world order. Lai Swen-Ti, an associate professor at the Center for European Studies at Guangdong University of Foreign Studies, said that it is unfair for von der Leyen to criticize us like we are power-thirsty and a destroyer. When the EU is seeing China working in multilateral bodies, isn't it an evidence itself that China is trying to make the current world order work? Lai added that China is helping in necessary reforms, namely reforming the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund. Von der Leyen's speech on November the 6th focused on three topics: Ukraine, the Middle East, and China. She said the rivalry between China and the EU can be constructive and not hostile. Now, to be fair, I looked the speech up, and this part is not a lie. That's exactly what von der Leyen said. But what I'm far more interested to know is why hasn't anyone criticized von der Leyen for saying this? See, this is one of the aspects that the ordo liberals in Europe, that is to say the people who support the current way of doing business and doing things in the European Union, most of them associated either financially or straight up ideologically with CDU in Germany, most of these people really, really want to run away from the fact that too many of their political exponents are aligned with China. They really are. And as long as things stay that way, it's kind of difficult to say that, well, anyone who has a different opinion, well, his mother is Putin or his mother is Xi Jinping. Well, I'm sorry, no, your mother is Xi Jinping. And that is a problem. And it's a problem that refuses to, that cannot be addressed as long as we continue to pretend that, well, this isn't happening, because that's exactly what we've been doing lately. We just keep on pretending that the political class in Europe is not aligned with China and Russia, when in fact it is. And this is why we need functioning channels of communications and high-level diplomacy. This is what I have called de-risking through diplomacy. And this is why we have invested in intensive dialogue with Beijing, from our high-level dialogues now to the upcoming EU-China summit that we will have in a couple of weeks. Yeah, the summit happened and it delivered exactly 0 results, as you would expect from anything the Европейский Союз would do. Because the EU diplomacy is just non-existent. So there's that. Now, of course, the CCP knows this, but by the same token, it is to the CCP's interest to promote these kinds of time-wasting initiatives, because that ensures that the political class is busy with these kinds of things rather than things more useful for Europe, for the West. Things like, I don't know, decoupling. But, you know, sometimes some politician in some country comes up with the idea, well, how about we just decouple? So then the CCP has a lot of those, has something for those too. Decoupling is simply not practical. Really? It's been practical for 7 years already? But anyway, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said on November the 2nd that decoupling of the world's 2 largest economies was simply not practical and would have disastrous effects, especially given the complexity of Asian supply chains and deep economic linkages to China in the region. She made the remarks at the Asia Society in Washington 10 days before leaders of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation members gather in San Francisco for an annual meeting from November 11th to 17th. So the next newspaper talks extensively about this. But you'll notice this, right? So, you know, it's a little bit more complicated because of the supply chains, and it would cost a lot of money. This basically boils down to what I've come to term among the Western political classes, normative materialism. Just because you know, the only thing that matters to these people is that the line keeps on going up. And I routinely ask, well, why should the line go always up? Why exactly is such a huge problem if, for the betterment of the civilization as a whole, for a while the line doesn't go up, or it does go up but just slower? Is it really such a huge issue if the line doesn't go up for a few years? You know, it was the same argument with Brexit, right? Oh my goodness, if Brexit is done, then there will be economic consequences and it would cost like £4,000 per household, or whatever the figure was cited by Project Fear, effectively. And enough of the British public was like, well, that doesn't sound actually like a lot of money, £4,000 over several years. Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, if that's the price, then yeah, sure, let's pay it. And that was a huge shock for these pseudo-elite people, because for them, the line going up is the most important thing, because they're all hooked on this ideology, this worldview, this obsession with the line always going up. Everything is calculated in GDP per capita and money, effectively. But, you know, some things are actually more important than money. And the British voters said, well, you know what, our sovereignty as Brits is more important than money. So why exactly should money or be the sole consideration on every geopolitical discussion, on every issue? All right, because in this case, decoupling is ultimately a geopolitical discussion, and it's actually not a huge deal if it costs a little bit. I mean, there is even neoliberal, I don't know how to call them, yeah, maybe neoliberal, circles are starting to realize and vocalize it. I mean, their circles basically put it this way: the West sold its manufacturing base in exchange for cheap t-shirts. Now, of course, this is an oversimplification of the issue, but even the neoliberals are starting to figure this one out. I mean, yeah, sure, the line always goes up, but what if it shouldn't? And what if the price of the line going up is maybe a bit too high? Have we considered that, or are we allowed to have this opinion, or is that too extremist, too far right or something? I don't know. Maybe it's too far right. Nevertheless, expect to see this kind of rhetoric a lot more in the next several years. Eventually, this whole green thing will die off because the support for that is just no longer there, not anymore, at least not to the extent that it was several years ago when this paper was written and when China was able to finance a lot of them. Now, China would still fund them today, but there is no longer an audience for it, let's put it this way. Anyway, last episode I mentioned how green propaganda can be used to distract attention. Here's another example. Life looks up for Xinjiang villages. Geography of vibrant and rich history. Xinjiang rivers, mountains, lakes bear witness to many stories of past civilizations. Yeah, like the Uyghur civilization, which we just extinguished in the Chinese gulag. Oh, oops, sorry, we're not supposed to talk about that, I know. Okay. Water resources better used, poverty eradicated, and services improved in the autonomous region. Yes, by shrinking the population, because you killed or cast away most of them. So sure, with the same resources being divided to fewer people, I suppose the standard of living did improve. Yeah. Anyway, the whole article is very careful not to talk about the drop in population, and of course nothing about the gulags. It's all about look how green policies have improved things in the Xinjiang villages. Nothing about the sterilization of people there, nothing about the gulags, nothing about the violence, the state-enforced violence. You can see as much as possible, you get friendly faces. It's even funny, a lot of these pictures which are supposed to be taken from the area, they've just selected out all of the Uyghurs. It's the Han minority appears more in this report. Anyway, moving forward, working together for the common good, the greater good. China-EU cooperation benefits global stability as well as mutual interest. Article by Yves Leterme, former Prime Minister of Belgium, which is also quite funny. I mean, this is where you find all of the failed politicians. The CCP, just like Russia, loves these kinds of politicians. This one is actually a top-tier acquisition by the CCP because he was a prime minister. But generally speaking, failed politicians in the West with pro-Russia or pro-China opinions usually get a job with these kinds of newspapers. They're not particularly well paid, but decently paid enough for it to worth it for them. Because, well, it's one thing to cite a former prime minister and a whole different thing to cite someone from an obscure think tank, as we've seen China Daily sometimes does. We are confronted with a world beset by crises, from regional conflicts and economic turbulence to the reverberations of anti-globalization sentiments, global pandemic, rising inequalities, technological disparities, climate change, energy concerns, terrorism, and cyber threats. All of the buzzwords in one phrase. The international security landscape is under its most severe strain since the Cold War. In these testing times, humanity is yearning for a world characterized by lasting peace and universal security. Let me guess, China is the solution, Mr. Prime Minister, right? Evidently, no single nation can ensure these in isolation. The interconnectedness of our world requires us to work together, finding common ground and shared solutions. China and the Европейский Союз, as two major global actors, have a critical role to play in shaping I'm sorry, the EU is less than half economically of the United States. Since when is the EU a major global actor? I mean, the very idea is laughable and false. But of course, as the former Prime Minister of Belgium and one of the politicians at fault for the EU being half of the United States, he won't talk about that, obviously. Cooperation is not only in our mutual interest, but also has a direct impact on global stability and prosperity. Ongoing high-level dialogues have served as a testament to our commitment to enhancing cooperation, covering various aspects such as the environment and climate, digital affairs, economy and trade, and strategic dialogue. Nevertheless, it is crucial to reinvigorate this partnership with enhanced trust and reduced mutual suspicion, embracing real openness over restrictions and shared responsibilities over exclusion. Yeah, more trust. It's actually quite funny because as I'm recording this, there is yet another scandal involving Chinese technology, this time around the alleged involvement by the Chinese platform, whatever app, social media company TikTok, and its alleged meddling in the Romanian presidential election. So it's actually quite funny to read Chinese propaganda in the middle of this highly emotional moment, which I don't share. I mean, to me, it's not an emotional moment, whatever. But nevertheless, China is discussing more trust, less suspicion, all while these things are also happening. So it's quite funny. Fostering global well-being via trade. So CIA is the China International Import Expo. So basically their exterior commerce bank. Underscores China's efforts to promote world prosperity, peace through economic exchanges. Yeah, in other words, buy stuff from us. Stop with those ideas of decoupling, because that would endanger the finances of the CCP, and of course we can't have that. Here's an interesting one. Rebooting globalization for the greater good. Changing world economy, tech progress create room for developing nations led by China to grow. I like this part, that they're actually more honest in this article about exactly what they want. They want basically globalism, but led by China. This is one of those rhetorical traps that too many anti-globalists, patriots, nationalists, or whatever they call themselves in the West, who on one hand, yes, they're correct on some of their criticism of globalization in general, but also of globalism as an ideology. But what they fail to take into consideration, and again, I'm not saying that they do this because they're CCP shills necessarily, although some of them are, but nevertheless, what they do fail to take into consideration is that globalism is not an exclusively Western idea. Globalism under one's guidance is an idea that is very much popular among the Chinese elites, among the Russian elites as well, although Russia is incapable of doing that, but they would love to. There are more powerful actors beyond the West who also dream of some version of globalism led by themselves, preferably, because these people are very modest and they would never dream themselves as global dictators. Yes, of course they would. Globalization is a concept full of contradictions and paradoxes. It brings countries closer and yet makes their conflicts more acute. Instead of making the world flatter and countries more alike, it promotes more diversified development patterns. Despite globalization, developing countries have seen great divergences in development, which are not always caused by external factors, but to a great extent by national strategies and policy choices, as well as affected by domestic political environment. A country's decision to support or oppose globalization hinges on its development stages, and it's also affected by its policy choices. The following aspects show that globalization is multifaceted. First, globalization has not been driven by the liberal ideas of several advanced economies. The first wave of globalization, started in the 1870s, was mainly driven by a sharp drop in transport and communication costs brought by technological progress. However, the UK, a major driver of the progress, long practiced mercantile principles, scrambling overseas and expanding overseas market in the colonial era with import restrictions to protect the domestic market. Similarly, although the US became the leader of globalization after World War II, protectionism has long been the main feature of its trade policy. Second, there are no fixed winners or losers of globalization. Now that it's a lie. Throughout history, there have been both great divergences and convergences in development. Okay, that's true. During the first wave of globalization, Western countries, by virtue of dividends from industrialization, widened their gap with the rest of the world. Such a gap reached its peak after the end of World War II, with Western countries accounting for 73% of the world economy. In the two waves of globalization after the war, developing countries' economic growth rates caught up with and then surpassed those of Western countries. Now that part is kind of false. In the meantime, the development gap with developing countries widened. Asian countries achieved a development miracle of sustained high-speed growth, standing out from the developing world. Latin American countries saw frequent economic turmoil and crises after implementing neoliberal reforms in the 1980s. African countries, following long-term economic stagnation, gained new growth momentum from taking part in global value chains since the turn of the century. However, in general, the current international economic trade and trade rules have restricted the policy space of developing countries, making it difficult for them to upgrade their industries and escape the middle income trap. There we go. This is the part that I was looking for. Basically, this is an article that tries to appeal to a constituency that in the West that just doesn't exist yet. The free traders in the West are in retreat these days, and even if they were ascending, they still agree largely with a more centrist, if I'm allowed this term, a more centrist approach to geopolitics. So even the most radical or militant free traders still do agree that, well, if we can't agree on common rules, then sanctions and tariffs and restrictions are going to be put in place. Right? So basically this article tries to have its cake and eat it too. On one hand, it wants to promote free trade, but on the other hand, wants to promote free trade allegedly for the benefit of the developing world, but in reality for the benefit of the Chinese contractors who stand to benefit from this. So yeah, very convoluted type of propaganda, but do expect to see it during the Trump administration. You will see a lot of this kind of rhetoric. West's plans face uncertainties. Slow actions, funding shortages deflate developed nations' claims of assisting the global south. Yeah, but 1.5 years later after this, the COP20 whatever conference ended up approving an even smaller amount of aid to the global south. So on its face, prima facie, if you want, this claim turned out to be true, but by the same token, the effects of it turned out to be not true. I mean, this argues that this will be a problem for the global stability and shit, but in reality, this was only a problem for the incomes of the Chinese contractors who gobbled up too many infrastructure projects in the developing world. And of course, from the West's perspective is, well, okay, so what? Oh no, the Chinese contractors will be poor. Good. This one is even funnier. This article by Harvey Jodin, I have no idea the ethnic origin of this guy, senior fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Drug crisis fight never ending. So it's basically a politicization of the death of actor Matthew Perry's. Actor Matthew Perry's untimely death at age 54 evoked a rare outpouring of emotions from the millions of fans who not only followed his idiosyncratic, sarcastic character for the 10 seasons that hit the sitcom Friends, but also Perry's well-publicized battles with alcohol and drug addiction and his passionate advocacy for ending the scourge of substance abuse. So instead of merely mourning his passing, we should use Perry's life as a lesson to get the United States and the global communities act together to redouble our efforts to end substance abuse. Well, I don't know, maybe China should stop supplying fentanyl to all of the drug markets? Maybe? Oh, okay, yeah, no, not like that. When I was posted to the United Nations International Narcotics Control Board in Vienna, Austria in 1981, oh my god, this is a boomer, I could see the US so-called war on drugs was not being won. Today, more than 4 decades later, the country has fallen further behind in the battle. Perry's life is simple proof of the US's failure. His substance abuse started at, okay, whatever. So basically a politicization. This kind of rhetoric is meant precisely to distract attention from China's role, not in the death of this particular actor, but in the rise of illicit drug trade writ large. And then the daily or the weekly, dare I say, the newspaper is called China Daily, but it's actually a weekly newspaper. So the weekly wish list, the rise of Global South. China ready to help developing countries modernize as they emerge as a collective force for change. I mean, there's no way I can read this. Maybe I should mention a few realities. I mean, some of the countries that the authors of this newspaper consider Global South are in fact countries that use the US dollar as not just as a de facto currency, but as an official currency. Just a short while ago, I was walking down the streets of cities in Ecuador where you make payments in US dollars. So no, some of the countries that they consider Global South are actually not in the South as well at all, such as the Russian Federation. So the whole rise of the Global South is mostly a wishful thinking, but it's the kind of wishful thinking that the planners in Beijing are hoping to, how should I put this, meme into reality. I mean, the plan is essentially to just flood the zone and just say it a billion times until it becomes truth. And, you know, I can't blame them because for some people, it actually works. Like, for instance, now it doesn't always work, but it doesn't have to always work. It just has to work once or twice for the purposes of this political project. So China Daily, the next week, November 17th, 23, greener pastures. Greater use of technology can unlock door to green transition for Asia Pacific, say the experts. You will notice that the word experts just keeps on appearing all over this paper. APEC must encourage right kind of growth. So you see, growth is good, but only if it benefits China. If it benefits anyone else but China, then of course growth is bad. There you go. Collaborative approach vital for advancing decarbonization. Yeah, this is what I was looking for. It should be noted that these talking points that were not just confined to the pages of this newspaper, but sent as a shockwave throughout the international media. Deutsche Welle was writing around the same period. Look it up, you don't have to believe me. Look it up in that week, in the middle of November, as Xi Jinping was visiting the United States and the meeting with Biden was taking place. Most of these talking points were present all over the media, And that's not by a coincidence. Right around that same time, the same time period, middle of November, the European Parliament was discussing the Green New Deal, which ended up failing, and not only failing, but failing so spectacularly that even some of the politicians who are big fans of this whole green shit ended up campaigning against it in the following summer, in the summer of 2024, for the European elections. And also, Xi Jinping was there trying in the US, trying to convince the Biden administration to embrace even more of that. But then the public sentiment shifted so hard against it that even the Democrats, through Kamala Harris, campaigned rather against this whole thing and more in favor of fossil fuels, because unlike solar panels and windmills and all of these cheap stuff produced by China, well, fossil fuels actually work. They don't turn off the lights, as it's been happening in Ecuador as a result of China-driven policies implemented by Rafael Correa, who is now sanctioned in the United States. Anyway, we'll have time to talk about Ecuador quite a bit. But nevertheless, that was the time when China was hoping to influence the conversation on all of these. Same newspaper, in the self-driving seed, China leading the way in autonomous vehicle tech, market expected to pass 500 billions by 2030. Now, of course, like any propaganda piece, and you will see this in green propaganda in the West as well, they'll cite a figure like this, but without putting it into context. I don't know, $500 billion. Well, for regular people who never have that much money, that sounds like a lot. But at the level of the global automobile market, $500 billion is effectively nothing. But then again, these kinds of propaganda articles are then used in Europe and North America as an excuse to ask for more subsidies under the excuse of, well, if we don't do this, then China will overcome us. I mean, China does this all the time. If they can use anti-China sentiment, they'll do it. And not just China. I mean, Elon Musk did some of these things as well to get some subsidies for his own companies, and it works because we still do have a boomer type of elite who think that just some shithole in the other end of the world is better than us at something. And instead of asking, okay, is that something really that important? But instead of asking that, they'll say, oh my goodness, we have to subsidize our own because heaven forbid we think about whether this whole thing is probably illegitimate. But no, we can't do that. Same thing, there you go, more militant and normative materialism. Europe cannot afford an anti-China game. Capitulation to the US-led wedge politics will only harm the EU and the bloc's economic woes, says Tom Fowdy, a British political and international relations analyst. That's how he is described. I'm pretty sure he is paid in yuan as well. Sources from Brussels are claiming that die-hard Atlanticists of the European Commission are fed up with what is described as China's economic practices, leading some mainstream media outlets to speculate about a potential trade war with China, especially in the field of batteries and electric vehicles. The demand is that China open up its markets further to accommodate European businesses. Of course, if one follows China's actions and rhetoric carefully, such an offer has never been off the table for Europe. Come on, it was. In fact, at the end of 2020, China and the European Union even had a deal to achieve just that. No, it wasn't. Which was known as the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. Oh, come on, that's a straight-up lie. It would seem that the EU has given up talk of such mutually compromising deal and is instead now intent on posturing threats of discontent to China in order to try and force through European unilateral terms. There is little guarantee, however, that such a confrontational approach will work, as the EU has never been able to exhibit autonomy as an independent foreign policy actor. So you will notice this framing does follow the same pattern that you've been seeing in the Russian propaganda game, right? So nobody here in Europe has any autonomy over its decisions. It's all US-led wedge politics, right? So the framing is always that, Europe would do more of China's bidding, or Russia's bidding for that matter, if not for those pesky Americans who always intervene and make things worse for everyone. This is the kind of framing that is so common both for China and for Russia. Now, of course, the reason they work is because there is some element of truth to that. I mean, Germany would sell pretty much anything for some more cheap Russian gas. That's how addicted they are. And definitely they would sell anything for some cheap labor in China for some of the German companies. So, some of that is true. But then again, the rest of Europe is not Germany. And, after the scandal where it showed that the CCP was listening up in real time the conversations of multiple Dutch prime ministers, let's just say that probably in the Netherlands there's not much love for the CCP, and they don't need a US-led wedge to tell them that the CCP is probably a terrible idea. Nevertheless, chance for US course correction. Biden has a chance to drop zero-sum game toward China amid geopolitical tension. President Biden is facing one of the most difficult geopolitical situations: a severe Russia-Ukraine conflict and Israel's ostensible and unrelenting action in Gaza, which has invited worldwide condemnation because of the sheer number of children. Whatever, this is standard nonsense. Through their actions towards the two conflicts, Europe and the US have alienated the world and are standing alone with their agenda of self-interest. Really, here we are 1 year and something after this article was written, and not much has changed, and Europe and the US are still not standing alone. I'm just saying. The situation is no better for Biden at home either. Rivals have launched vociferous attack against his performance. Now, that's true. Although the economy is doing relatively well, the international crisis will impact the US soon. Additionally, thanks to the protectionist measures that Washington has adopted and the sanctions that it imposed on countries, the dollar's relevance as a global reserve currency has gradually reduced. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not true. It still hasn't. And quite frankly, the yuan is still less relevant than it should be given the size of the Chinese economy. So, yeah, but again, this is one of those useful thinking. This whole talking point about the dollar's relevance has been broadcasted loudly by both Chinese and Russian think tanks, propaganda outlets, newspapers, whatever, shills, whatever you want to call them, all of them at once. Has been broadcasted so many times that now you do have people in the West who genuinely believe it. And again, it wouldn't be such a huge tragedy if it were true, but it also isn't. And it's an example of how crude methods of propaganda can still work, provided that you have enough of quantity. And to be fair, China can deliver quantity, and that includes propaganda as well. I mean, this newspaper is not an example of it, but there have been situations in the past where basically Chinese trolls would flood the zone with all sorts of messaging that was convenient for the current political project of the CCP. So yeah, all of this is a testament of, if you look precisely, because that's exactly how it should be done, you look at it in context. Just when the European Parliament was discussing at subcommittee levels, mind you, was discussing about the Green New Deal, that's when China had its most quote-unquote reasonable messaging about decarbonization, green stuff. And the purpose of those was not to persuade readers like me, but to persuade MEP staffers, think tankers, and whatnot. Not even just people aligned with China, but unsuspecting targets. because that's exactly the point of this posh version of Chinese propaganda. You publish it in China daily, someone aligned with China reads it, thinks it's a good idea, and then that someone shills it to someone who doesn't know that you read it and you're parroting China daily. And then if that person, because that other person is ignorant, thinks it's a good idea or at least doesn't sound that bad, then that person shills it into a relevant circle, and by that point everyone has forgotten where the idea came from to begin with. That's the purpose of these kinds of newspapers. And as we read some of these from here and we realize that they became a more mainstream talking point on the left or sometimes on the right several weeks later or several months later, that's how we realize just how insidious this kind of propaganda is. And it's much more insidious than the Russian propaganda because, well, it's better written. They do have more people, more quantity, not necessarily more quality, but definitely more quantity. They have more people looking into it and trying to make it as palatable as possible. And of course, that also means it can be more effective. So yeah, all right, that will be enough for today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. If you like this kind of thing, consider giving a shekel, and I'll see you all soon. Cheers.